What is Victorian?
When I say Victorian, I'm referring specifically to the P-bar Victorian. So this is done on the parallel bars apparatus and not the rings. That's called a ring Victorian, which is much harder, and I haven't unlocked that yet. P-bar Victorian is a skill where you suspend your body with straight arms. Some of the form standards are your arms need to be straight. You need to have a straight line from your shoulders to your toes, and your hips need to be roughly level with your hands. And let me just explain what I mean by that really quick. There's kind of 3 levels of height, which I want to talk about. There's this one, where you're Victorian, your hands are at the top of your thigh. To me, that's not validated as the actual skill. To count it, I would personally want the hand to be at the center of the hips. If you go here, that's basically like the same difficulty as a floor Victorian, which is way harder than a normal Vic. So that's what I mean when I say your hips need to be at the level of your hands. Next thing we should talk about are the prerequisites. Before you even really consider training this skill, you should know what level you need. And I think the most important prereq that I would consider is having a full front lever for maybe 10 seconds. I think it's just really important to have that base of pulling strength. Front lever trains shoulder extension in a more narrow shoulder position, and you're also developing your retraction, right? There are other exercises like touch front lever, dragon press, and front lever pull-ups. The more developed these other progressions are for you, the easier it'll be to learn the Victorian. But you can probably start training Vic without those other skills, if that is your main goal. Although I will say dragon press is a really specific prereq towards Victorian. The better your dragon is, the better your Victorian will be. Most basic stuff is just like the body weight tuck, advanced tuck, super advanced tuck, and full. You can't really straddle on Victorian because your hands are blocking your legs. For banded progressions, you can do the same stuff as well. Generally, you just hook a band up to your pull-up bar and then you can execute your Victorian. This is assuming you're doing it on parallettes. Let's talk about the technique really quick. I have my P-bars taped up just because it puts a lot of pressure on the elbows. So if you have elbow sleeves or something cushiony, like a sweater, that can help out a decent amount. First, we're gonna do the entry. I like keeping it roughly shoulder width, and then I position my elbows slightly on the inside of the parallettes. And you can see I grip a little bit underneath like that, just because I personally execute Vic with a good amount of external rotation. I'll talk about why I think that's important later on. And then there's 2 entries, but I think the easier one is this. You basically start out with above the P-bars, and you lean back into it like that. So you're already in position by the time you lift off. This is going to be slightly low, but it looks like this. I should have warmed up. So that's entry number 1. Gonna rest a bit before I do entry number 2. So let's talk about why I think external rotation is kind of important in this skill. Basically, when you externally rotate, that's really helpful as you start to push higher. Because when you're internally rotated, the muscles in your back, like your lats, your teres, are more dominant in the movement. But the higher you go, the more shortened they are and the worse leverage they have. So here, these back muscles are really strong, but as you go higher and higher, they become a lot weaker. Whereas if you externally rotate, your rear delt is more dominant. From here to here, your rear delt still has pretty good leverage. Personally, I like external rotation in the Victorian versus internal because it promotes height better, in my opinion. But I've seen people do Vic with internal rotation who have better height than me, so might be a bit subjective of an opinion. Let's show you the next entry. I show you the first entry where you start with height, and I think that is better. Second entry is almost like a elevation. You start lower and then you increase your height. Okay, so I'm gripping my elbows slightly on the inside of the bar. I grip outside with my hand, and then basically I raise into the Vic. So it looks like this. So that entry is probably the one I used to learn it, but I like the first one a little bit more. I'm not gonna go into depth on the tuck, advanced tuck, super advanced tuck, because I think you guys should know what that looks like for pulling progressions. But I do kind of want to show a couple of accessory movements which I think are pretty good for the Victorian. So there's two. The first is the dragon press, which some of you might already know because I talked about it and made a tutorial on it. And the second is Victorian leans, which you probably haven't seen before. Let's start with the Victorian leans. Those are easier. So with this movement, you basically do everything except lift your feet off the ground, if that makes sense. My feet are still touching the ground, but I'm still leaning backwards like this. And you can hold it, or you can do elevations like that. I personally like conditioning with elevations. And this is a really nice way to grease the groove on Vic without being too intensive. That's the Vic lean. Another thing that you can do is you can also do this in wider variations, right? I'll show from a wider perspective and a different angle. So, like this. I really like Vic leans, or these like Vic lean elevations for conditioning days. And there's one last version, which I think this is a really fun progression. It's like a Vic lean, but you're doing it this way instead of this way. Hard to really do this setup with my feet under the bed, but it looks kind of like this. Obviously I wasn't showing the best technique because my feet were literally under this thing, but that's kind of the idea. And yeah, really good conditioning movement. The next is called the dragon press, with dragon press on P-bars, which is the way I like to do it, because fingertips is, you're making your fingers the limiting factor, but on P-bars it's purely strength. So I like to rotate the parallel slightly inward so I can secure a false grip. And then note that the higher your parallels are, the easier it is, because this is basically a front lever in this position. It looks like this. Right? You can press into it. But really good conditioning movement. It really isolates the rear delts. So let's talk about programming really quick. Now, the further I progress into skill training, the less I'm a fan of extremely rigid structured programming for this stuff, just because there's so many variations that train such similar attributes. And when I say that, it's like touch front and Vic both train very similar attributes. SAT and Vic, FLPU, right? Like all these things train, I like to think of it instead of skills as attributes, because you know, when you train a movement in the gym, you train your bench press and then you train your shoulder press. Those are almost like two entirely different movement patterns, but in pulling, everything eventually becomes very similar in nature. So I think the important thing is like, okay, what attribute am I training? And that way you can actually train more skills, because when you train by attribute rather than skill, you're not limited to the 2 skills at a time kind of mindset, which you might have with like a more structured program. But that's a little bit more of a philosophical take on programming, but let's kind of give you some practical takeaways. I think it depends first of all on what your level in this skill is. If you haven't unlocked it, so let's assume you're somewhere between advanced tuck and maybe close to a full. It'll depend on your priorities. Let's assume you already have a 10-second front lever. If your top priority is Vic, of course you should put this at the beginning of your session, starting out the session with body weight holds, not necessarily 1 rep max attempts, but controlled holds. You can also do press variations, right? So Vic press in the advanced tuck is probably not too hard. And then banded holds. Banded holds are going to be great. And this is probably actually what you can train presses the most on. After that, you would train probably like something in a less extended shoulder position because you already trained this range of motion. If you were to train touch, you'd probably be a bit too gassed, at least for me. So I would probably train like a front or FLPU after that. I think that makes sense. And this is assuming you're training purely for skills, like you're not doing weighted pull-ups or something like that. But weighted pull-ups is also an option. I think important note is like if you're training Vic and then you're training like front after that, even if you have a 10-second front, don't assume that you should just train full front after doing like 5 sets of hard Vic, because the Vic is gonna gas you out, right? You don't wanna gas out on front lever after gassing out on Vic. For front, even if you have 10 seconds, it might still be a good idea to train bands, just to focus on the activation of the movement and not overly gas out. But probably a light band would be good. Same thing with FLPU. Now, when it comes to frequency of your training, I think this is a bit nuanced. You can definitely train this skill at a higher frequency, but maybe not high intensity attempts like what I did earlier at a high frequency. For example, you could do like maybe 2 or 3 sessions where you actually do Vic holds and banded holds. And then on your recovery days, you can do like accessories like the Vic leans or the dragon presses that I talked about. It kind of gives you like a decent amount of like room to adjust your programming, and it kind of depends also on like your work schedule. Some people can't train almost every day, and some people don't have the energy and time for it, and I'm one of those people. Lastly, let's kind of talk about the Vic press and wide Vic and harder stuff. With Vic press, you're not just holding here, you're pushing here, and this part is really hard. It's really hard to like extend and push higher, because unlike the front lever press where the bottom is the sticking point, the higher you go, the harder it is on Vic press. So personally, I think to get Vic press, you kind of have to train specifically for it. You can't really have a good Vic and then expect to have a Vic press. So banded Vic presses are good, or maybe even dragon presses with like a huge range of motion are also good. But I haven't unlocked it really fully yet, so I'm not going to speak too much on that. With wide Victorians, this is kind of where my tip about external rotation becomes a bit iffy, because the wider you go on like a neutral P-bar setup, like this kind of straight P-bar setup, the more it forces you into internal rotation. So if you're doing like a super wide P-bar Victorian, you're basically forced to do it in internal rotation, which is really hard to do with good height for me. But here, up to here, you can still do with external. But if you really want, you could also, what I personally do for wide Vic is I don't do it strictly like this. I actually rotate the parallettes outward a bit so I can still externally rotate. But yeah, wide Vic is really freaking hard. In normal Vic, you're pressing through your forearm, this around your center of mass. But in wide Vic, you start to press like literally at your wrist or your hand, and it's a lot harder to do. Those are some thoughts. I hope you didn't find this video too disorganized. Victorian is honestly not the most technical skill. I think it's just really focusing on height, some retraction, right? So I didn't speak on this, but you don't want to do Vic with protraction, in my opinion. It doesn't look as good, and you're kind of using that. The only reason you do it probably is to internally rotate, so you have more ability to contract your lats like this, but I don't like that. I like this kind of Vic, where you're actually pushing with good extension and external rotation, neutral to retracted shoulders, but kind of harder that way, in my opinion. It's better for height though. Quick note on floor Vic. This one is kind of interesting. There's this one where you're on your elbows and your fingertips, and then there's this one where you're just on your forearms. This one is easier, this one is harder, because you can use more tricep here. I don't have floor Vic, so I won't speak too much on it, but it requires even more extension strength than regular. So like this is regular, this is floor Vic, right? And to get your hand off your hips off the floor just requires so much strength. I think I could achieve floor Vic in time, but this is another one of those things like Vic press, which I think I need to train very specifically for it. Lastly, I guess we can talk about ring Vic, which honestly I haven't really come close to. I think I haven't gotten a good setup to train it. The thing about ring Vic is because the rings rotate freely, it's hard to really set up a good external rotation. What I mean is whenever I do Vic or whenever I do Sat, so let's just start with Sat because that's easier to explain. I actually grip it like this and I torque into external rotation. But my hand kind of counters that torque and it kind of creates this tension which helps keep me locked in the movement. My hand is kind of trying to promote internal rotation. My shoulders are externally rotating against my hand, and that creates a lot of nice tensions to keep me in place. With ring Vic, if I rotate like this, right, my hand's not going to resist that. And I think that's something that makes it kind of weird for me. But the activation here with ring Vic, I know how it feels a little bit. So first I definitely need like heavy wrist wraps because a lot of pressure on the bone of your forearm. Because if I were to ring Vic, I would use an omni grip, where I'm basically pushing into the rings like that. And I would be using more internal rotation than like a strictly, like I'm not gonna be ring Vicking like this, you know? Personally, I haven't really started training for it yet, but maybe when I do, I'll talk about it in a video. Okay, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.